So this is where normally I would invite my panel up to the stage, but they're all virtual. So I think as I've heard they're all online, so you'll actually get to see them. I'm really been looking forward to this panel. I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Sorry, I'm pulling up my notes. So just to give you some background on why we thought it was relevant to this conversation in this conference, discussions on space security and multilateral fora have been at a standstill for decades, as the major space actors disagree on both what the biggest threats to space security are and how best to approach them. This is happening despite space's increasing importance to international security and the global economy, as well as a concomitant proliferation of counter space capabilities. Over the last decade and a half, states have put forward several initiatives to strengthen space security, but have limited success. In December 2020, the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution proposed by the United Kingdom, UNGA 75/36, that calls for member states to provide their thoughts on threats to space security, proposals to dealing with those threats, including developing norms of behavior for space. Submissions were due by last May, and the Secretary General of the UN released his compilation report this August. So how does this effort differ from other more, let's face it, ineffective initiatives? It does in several different and important ways. First, by asking each country what they consider to be a threat, the resolutions attempts to find common ground and the most important threats to address. You can't create a solution if you can't at least agree on what the problem is, and that has stymied space security discussions to date. Second, it sidesteps a disagreement about whether the results of the multilateral discussions must end up as legally binding treaties or just soft power norms of behavior. Third, it allows the entire international community to shape the conversation about what responsible or irresponsible behavior is. Finally, the focus on behavior and not technology both encourages future communication and transparency, while at the same time avoids many of the definitional issues that have plagued space arms control discussions in the past. SSA is particularly relevant for this last part in terms of figuring out behavior, as if you're going to be looking at behavior on orbit, you need to be able to verify actions, and obviously SSA plays a huge role in that. So with that, I'd like to start to my first speaker, David Edmondson, who's the policy head, Space Security and Advanced Threats, Space Policy Department, United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah, trying to find the unmute button on this particular Zoom device. So thank you very much for this. Allow me to sort of start with to thank Karine, I guess, for her remarks and in the keynote there, and for introducing some of the work that we've been doing. For me, really what I wanted to talk to you about today is the perception of threat and responsible behaviors. So certain counter space capabilities, when they're deployed, they make a state feel that they're being threatened. So the existence of these capabilities, their permitted operation in the absence of accepted behaviors or rules, that raises the credibility of those threats. So in order to manage or mitigate these perceptions of threat, a common understanding needs to be established between the actor state and the state being impacted. So a state which is being impacted needs to understand the intent or the message being sent to the development, deployment, or the use of a capability. And that's whether or not the affected state agrees with the content of that message. The state also needs to have, with the perceived threatening state, a shared view of how perceptions of threat against space systems feed into escalation calculations, and then to understand whether there are differences between the two state actors over what is considered generally safe state practice. So in some cases, a perceived threat may not in fact be an intended threat. By focusing on intent and observable behavior, which is why I'm here today, rather than capabilities, it's possible to create a set of practices or behaviors which might increase trust and foster greater transparency. So for the UK, the use of the word behaviors is a linguistic shortcut for actions, operations, activities, and omissions against space systems. So Karine set out how we got here. We actually won in the overall General Assembly last year with 164 votes, following on from the vote in the first committee with 150. We're delighted. We submitted a report to the Secretary General to be included in his work. We talked about 7 threat areas and offered up 11 possible behaviours. These included, or the 7 types of activity, the threat areas were destruction of or threat to destroy a satellite, direct ascent ASAT use, non-kinetic threats such as lasers, threats aimed at creating loss of imagery or sight from space assets, interference with PNT signals from satellites, reducing the ability of a ground operator to control a satellite, and rendezvous operations and proximity operations. And you'll note that we now split those out because they are different problems. The 36 submissions from the other states, the international organizations and think tanks, split into 3 camps. So space within wider national security. So that's this allied view of how responsible space behaviors can maintain and enhance collective national defense and global security. It's a view that the more we understand each other's capabilities and doctrine, the safer the world is. There's a middle ground of a sort of sustainable space environment group which is focused on maintaining peace in space for the sake of a sustainable space environment. For me, they're often well-meaning, but with limited knowledge of modern space systems. And then there's a group that denied that this work really had utility and that behaviours are not part of disarmament discussions. And they try and push all discussions of responsible space behaviours to the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space to de-link terrestrial and sub-conflict counter-space systems from wider national defence, despite space being an integral part of military systems. So the report from the Secretary-General issued mid-August 2021, and the UK's strategic aim is to prevent miscalculation and escalation from hostile activity against space systems leading to conflict. So we want to prevent it leading to conflict. We want to keep our space systems secure and ensure they not become an area of vulnerability. Keep in mind the link between a behaviour to a perception of threat. So when you do this, I perceive that. As Karine mentioned, we will table a UN General Assembly resolution to set up an open-ended working group. And of course, open-ended is the number of nations, not the duration. We want to deliver 3 things. Firstly, space security experts can talk in groups, small and large, and start to build that shared understanding. Second, we can shape the global narrative to our advantage, building an international consensus against behaviours that threaten to bring conflict to space. So those first 2 are jobs for me and the team that I work with. And then finally, we'll incrementally produce a list of agreed operational and strategic behaviours that reduce the risk of conflict starting into and through space. So in modern deterrence theory, states will self-limit their actions if they understand them to be internationally unacceptable and or likely to lead to conflict. So the open-ended working group will be tasked to take stock of the existing international frameworks governing state behaviour concerning outer space, consider current and future threats to space systems and behaviours that could be considered irresponsible, and then make recommendations on possible norms, rules and principles of responsible behaviour relating to those threats, including, as appropriate, how these recommendations could contribute in future to a legally binding instrument, and submit a report to the General Assembly in 2 years. Meanwhile, we'll continue to message on separating the threats from states, which is a disarmament problem and not well understood by the global space community, I think, from the risks and hazards in space, which is a peaceful uses of space problem and much discussed. I recently gave a speech on this split at COPUOS. We'll look to build the understanding between states on perception of threat, and I look to you all to provide the SSA through which we can monitor those responsible space behaviours. I thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, our next speaker is Jessica West, a senior researcher with Project Plowshares.
Hi, thanks, Victoria. Aloha from Ontario. To begin, I just want to reiterate appreciation for this process, but also the really robust civil society participation that's taken place so far. And I'll point out that in addition to Project Plowshares, we had Secure World Foundation, CSIS, Carnegie Foundation, Observer Research Foundation, RAND, and the Peaceful Use of Lasers in Space Initiative all submitted reports as part of the first step of the process, and they're all worth a read. My own response on behalf of Project Plowshares focused on some of the key takeaways from a study that I led last year with a colleague, Gilles Doucette, which was made possible with funding from the Canadian Department of National Defence. In response to the growing interest in norms as a tool of security in outer space, we wanted to take the time to probe the existing normative landscape with a focus on what currently exists, What does this look like in practice? And how can the existing framework be used as a springboard or to fill in some of the gaps in security-related norms in space? I think this type of big picture survey is really important because norms are relational. We know that as operators, we can't operate our systems in space without an awareness and an accommodation of what others are doing. And the same is true of norms. You know, individual rules don't exist independent of each other and the prevailing values that inform and motivate our conduct. So efforts to think about new norms need to take the existing framework into consideration to be successful, and can also use that as a starting point for moving forward. So what did we find? I think one point that is clear and deserves reiterating is that arms control, conflict prevention, and humanitarian values are core to this picture, but the associated norms and rules are underdeveloped and perhaps underappreciated. The international community really does have an obligation to work on this. How do we work on this? One place to start is by thinking about the risks to these objectives in space. And I think what the submissions make clear is that there are many individual risks in space posed by hardware and technical capabilities and certain behaviors. But a persistent theme in our work is that it's the nature of the operating environment itself that is also a key driver of insecurity in space, specifically lack of transparency and trust, which is often underpinned by poor communication practices or non-existent communication practices, as well as an absence of effective mechanisms that we can use to manage potential threats and perceptions of threats to maintain stability and collective security. Addressing these gaps really should be a priority moving forward. Transparency and communication can be enhanced through improved practices. A lot of these are not new, but maybe they're not as well implemented as they could or should be. This includes pre-notifications, registration and disclosure, information exchange, consultations. Widely accessible data sharing and data tools are also essential, and it's been really exciting this week to hear presentations with creative ideas to make some of these processes feasible. I also think that we should prioritize low-hanging fruit. We can clearly commit to practices that are in line with existing obligations. This is what I like to call norm fruit salad. A ban on debris-creating anti-satellite tests is one possible example of this approach. And if anyone has not yet seen the letter from the Outer Space Institute, I'll give it a quick plug. But I think the most important conclusion that we came across is that to do any of this, process is key. I like to borrow from Catherine Sekink's work on cyber norms, where she says, you know, the process is the product. And so going forward, it's essential that the process be as inclusive as possible. And this requires an effort to nurture and expand like-mindedness among diverse actors. We can do this by going back and starting with those shared values and principles and focusing on mutual obligations and benefits. I think in our public discussions, it's often really tempting to focus on finger pointing and bad behavior in space. But if we want to develop norms, we really have to regroup and focus on the good behaviors and have sort of a carrot approach rather than just a stick approach. And as part of this process, we have to focus on the practical side of norms. So not just the ideas or the statements, but the standards and the mechanisms and the processes that we need to propagate and practice and promote those desired behaviors. I think we currently have a huge institutional deficit in space that needs to be addressed to help make this work by making it easier to interact with one another at both a high level and an operational level. And because the process is the product, we have to make sure that our words and actions in space are consistent with the practices that are already existing that we want to continue to propagate, as well as the new ones that we want to nurture. But when we think about these words and these practices and the actions, we can't lose sight of the bigger picture and the driving goal of the process, which is really the prevention of an arms race and armed conflict in outer space. This is something that we have to work together on collectively, and I think that's why it's so important to see that the UK is pitching an open-ended working group specifically under this mandate at the United Nations. As usual, there's more details in the online document, but I'll hand it over to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I'd just like to remind the audience that we will have the opportunity to have some questions for the panel, so be thinking of them, and we know the routine how to send them in. So hopefully we'll have some time at the end. Our next speaker is Eric Desautels, who's the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Emerging Security Challenges and Defense Policy. Bureau of Arms Control, Verification and Compliance, the U.S. Department of State. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Victoria. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak before the AMOS conference today. I really appreciate it, especially thanks to the Maui Economic Development Board for inviting me. I want to apologize to them right off the start. I went looking for my Hawaiian shirt and I could not find it. Next time, if I am ever invited back to this conference, I will definitely make sure to be better prepared. Now, David has provided a really good background about the purpose of the resolution, so I'm going to focus on a few key points regarding the U.S. submission. First of all, the United States government has long sought to promote a framework of responsible behavior in outer space, including the pursuit and effective implementation of best practices, standards, and norms of behavior. You can find statements supporting that approach in many of our guidance documents, including the current National Space Policy and President Biden's Interim National Security Strategic Guidance. We undertook this process in the UN focused on behaviors because we believe that the implementation of norms can help reduce the possibility of misunderstanding and miscalculation between national security satellites operating in space. Moreover, the alternative of developing a legally binding arms control agreement would take longer to develop, and verification is a significant challenge. Even if you could successfully define what a weapon is, how would you see that there was a weapon on a satellite operating 200, 700, or 36,000 kilometers away from the Earth? The proposals that we've seen that advocate for a legally binding arms control solution are, among other problems, not effectively verifiable. But we believe you can craft norms around behaviors that would be observable and therefore be able to confirm whether a behavior is responsible or not. So we were very pleased to co-sponsor this resolution and to provide a US submission which is contained in UN document A/76/77. In particular, this is the first time the US government put forth a substantial description of our views on responsible national security behavior in space. David's submission at 20 pages was a little bit broader than the 9-page US submission, but that is because the US focused specifically on answering the 3 topic questions addressed in the resolution. And just to recap, those were study existing threats, characterize actions, and share ideas on further development and implementation of norms, rules, and principles. Now, Victoria has not given me enough time to go through every detail of our report, but let me just talk about a couple of the items. On the first topic, the US sought to provide a clear picture of the type of threats we are seeing, covering all categories from ground and in space. For the second topic, on characterizing activities, the submission addresses 9 categories of behaviors, efforts, or measures which could be considered during further development of these norms. These can be viewed as strategic level principles. Then for the third topic on sharing ideas, the United States wanted to avoid being too prescriptive in our recommendations. We continue to have discussions within the US government and with allies about specific concepts for norms for national security space activities, but we don't have all the answers. And so there is a need for more dialogue in order to fully develop those ideas. That is why you frequently see the use of the word could in our submission. We recognize, and it is reflected in this document, that this really is just the beginning of a conversation. That conversation must include understanding the perspective of allies in other countries. There are a number of challenges. For example, we've got a challenge in language. The English language words of safety and security are often translated as the same word in many other languages. And even though this effort is focused on national security space-related matters, there is the commercial perspective to consider. In particular, the US wants to ensure that we do not undercut discussions on measures for spaceflight safety in the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or UN COPUOS. We also want to make sure that this effort seeks to avoid having a negative impact on the innovations in commercial industry so that that industry can continue to deliver real benefits for how everyone uses outer space. Finally, I want to emphasize that the recently released Department of Defense tenets is entirely consistent with the US submission to the UN. You can see similar concepts reflected in both documents. And of course, the ideas in this submission are consistent with existing US obligations and commitments in outer space. As we said in our submission, the development of voluntary, non-legally binding norms of behavior in outer space does not replace or alter states' obligations or rights under international law, but rather provides additional specific considerations on what constitutes responsible behavior related to outer space. And while there are challenges to advancing this effort, I think there are a number of important opportunities. First, having read the submissions from other countries, there are many similarities among the ideas presented. I think that these submissions can form the basis for important conversations between states. Second, I believe that this is an issue that many of you in the audience can help with. We believe in this approach because behaviors are something we could confirm using space situational awareness capabilities. You hear a lot from the Department of Defense about the need for more space situational awareness. I want to add that the State Department wants it too, though of course we don't actually have any money with which we can pay for it. But we definitely support international partnerships on this issue. If this approach to developing norms of responsible behavior is going to work, we need countries other than the United States also to be able to observe behaviors in space. It can't just be the United States observing the space domain and calling out behaviors. This effort will be much more successful through academic, civil, commercial, and military partnerships in space situational awareness around the globe. So to close, there are challenges and opportunities, but I am optimistic. After many years about talking about wanting to lead in developing and implementing norms, we have now put forth a vision. The UK's proposed 2021 resolution seeks to build on what we started with the UN General Assembly Resolution 7536. And the United States looks forward to continuing this important work. And it will be incumbent upon us to work with the international community to make the positive case for our approach and to use the diplomatic tools available to us to deliver on this approach. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Eric. Next, we have Wen Zhou, the legal advisor of the Arms Unit, excuse me, for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Wen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. At the outset, allow me to thank the Secure World Foundation and the organizers of AMOS Policy Forum for inviting me on behalf of the ICRC to participate in this important discussion and share our views. So in line with the humanitarian mission and specific expertise on international humanitarian law, the International Committee of the Red Cross also submitted a position paper in reply to Resolution 7536 in April this year. So I will use the next few minutes to present very briefly the key messages in this paper and offer our views regarding the next steps. As was already noted by previous speakers, the use of space and space objects have been an integral part of contemporary warfare for several decades, and the role of space systems in military operations during armed conflict increases. The likelihood of this system being targeted, whether it be their ground or space components, or the. Maybe I stop video. Maybe that can make the connection better.
All right, so you can go just to audio.
Sorry about that. So the possible threats to space systems include electronic warfare, cyber attacks, directed energy attacks, and orbital-based and ground-based anti-satellite weapons. The use of weapons space could have significant impacts on civilians on Earth. This is because technology enabled by space systems impacts most aspects of civilian life, including those are critical for civilian safety or essential to their survival. The potential
When we lost you again.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Sorry about that. I was saying that it is important to underline that military operations in outer space do not occur in legal vacuum, but are constrained by existing international law, in particular, the Outer Space Treaty. And this principle was also recalled in the Resolution 7536. We like to recall that relevant international law include notably the Outer Space Treaty, the UN Charter, and International Humanitarian Law, IHL. And in particular, the IHL established rules on the conduct of cities and restricts the choice of weapons, means, and method of warfare that could be placed and or used in outer space in the event of an armed conflict, notably with a view to protecting civilians.
When I think we lost you again. When, I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Hello? Sorry about this. Well, I suppose the internet is not as good in Geneva as in the United States. In any case, where I was saying that the ICRC recommended any future discussion processes, including those in relation to responsible behavior, acknowledge first the potentially significant human cost for civilians on Earth of the use of weapons in outer space, and secondly, the protection afforded by IHL rules that restrict belligerents' choice of means and method of warfare, including in outer space. So we are very pleased that these two aspects are acknowledged by a number of replies to Resolution 7536, including those of the United Kingdom, United States, as well as organizations such as Secure World Foundation and Project ProShare. We are also very pleased to see that under UK's leadership, states are starting to negotiate a follow-up resolution to be adopted later this year, aiming at setting up an open-ended working group to further the discussion. In this respect, we believe that the open-ended working group.
When we lost you.
Hello.
Hello. We heard you, open-ended working group.
Right. In our view, the open-ended working group should ensure an open and inclusive process for exchanges of views between states. To include, among others, humanitarian aspects of irresponsible behaviors, and to consider existing legal frameworks, including
When we lost you, the existing legal frameworks. Maybe we could have you come back and try again in a minute. Let's move on to our next speaker. I'm sorry about that, Wen. It's just maybe your internet will clear up in a sec. Audrey Schaefer is a director for space policy, the National Security Council. Audrey, let's hope your internet is working a little bit stronger. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Victoria. I'll keep my fingers crossed over here. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate on the panel today. I know I don't want my remarks to be duplicative with Eric's as the other US speaker. And so what I wanted to try and do is really kind of step back and provide a little bit of a frame in terms of how, the new Biden administration in the United States is thinking about space diplomacy as well as strategic competition to really help complement this discussion, which has been, obviously very focused on 7536. So when we look at the, national security and foreign policy priorities of this administration, a key guidepost has been the president's interim national security strategic guidance, a little bit of a mouthful, which was released in March of this year. And if you haven't read it, I would really commend it to you. It's actually a very short document and does a really good job of framing, this administration's approach to national security and foreign policy, its guiding principles as well as its values. And the guidance, lays out an agenda for strengthening the enduring advantages of the United States, in the midst of a really challenging global security landscape. It also highlights quite prominently the role of diplomacy as a tool of first resort, as opposed to a tool of last resort. And so with that kind of broad frame, I look at diplomacy and strategic competition, which is also a thread that runs quite prominently through the document. And I see that, playing out pretty significantly in the space domain as well. I think what you'll see is a very active competition within a number of diplomatic fora regarding what the future of global space governance should look like. There are different perspectives on what the greatest challenges are that are facing the global community, as well as different approaches for how to address those challenges, right? And we've heard from a number of our speakers, right, about some of those like differences of opinion, whether you're talking legally binding or voluntary measures, whether you're talking about restricting capabilities or restricting behaviors. Not all of these ideas are necessarily mutually exclusive, but the community can only focus on so many things at once. So I think the competition I see is really just in terms of what ought to be the priority, where should we start, and how do we sort of build over time. And what I can say, is sort of thus far, this administration has been very focused on the development of norms and other measures to really get after that strategic stability challenge. We have had quite a number of successes over the last few years in the sort of safety and sustainability space, the long-term sustainability guidelines, of course. And I think it's really time to focus on that, sort of unique security element that has sort of been lacking for a long time. And so, 7536 is really a fantastic platform to have that discussion. And quite frankly, what it does is I think it opens the aperture, as Eric said, for a sort of a wider range of measures to be discussed than sort of what has been traditionally focused on in some of the venues that have been around, for decades and decades. And, many of the features of that process that Dave already highlighted, provide a unique opportunity for the participation of really a broad swath of space actors. So, from a US perspective and a sort of a US and allied perspective, I think we're looking forward for the opportunity to really help lead that discussion. Eric mentioned the US submission and he outlined the contents of that. I'm not going to go over that again, but I think what you see between that document and the tenets of behavior document that he also flagged that was recently released by Secretary of Defense Austin provides a foundation for really deepening that conversation at the international level. I did want to just flag the tenets that are in that Secretary of Defense memo. There are 5 of them. The first is operate in, from, to, and through space with due regard to others and in a professional manner. The second is limit the generation of long-lived debris. The third, avoid the creation of harmful interference. Fourth, maintain safe separation and safe trajectory. And fifth, communicate and make notifications to enhance the safety and the stability of the domain. So I think taking that plus the US submission is really an excellent foundation. And we're going to be looking to develop, additional detail that hopefully can feed into the process as it goes forward. So with that, Victoria, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Audrey. I'm reminding the audience we do have time for some questions, but I can ask questions all day. But maybe some others want to send some stuff up. My first question to the panel is reading through the submissions for 75/36. A couple commonalities emerge in terms of ideas that people think of responsible behavior or irresponsible behavior. And one of them was the idea that it's a norm should be emerging about it's bad form to deliberately create long-lived debris. And so I'm curious to know what the panel thinks, what that means. Does that mean that perhaps the international community is leading the way to possibly endorsing in some way, shape, or form some sort of kinetic energy anti-satellite test ban treaty? I'm curious if the panel will think about that. So whoever would like to take that. And we should have them up on screen because I can't see anyone right now. With that, we'll start with one of the non-governmental people for now. Jessica West, what do you think about that?
Sure, plug me in. Writing on it. First, I think this is an idea that has been trickling beneath the surface, especially at the UN for a couple of years now. I follow closely the statements that are made at the UN First Committee, and it's certainly a theme in a lot of those statements, something that Canada has proposed, and I want to name others, but I don't want to get them wrong, so I won't. You can go back and read some of my previous writings on that. I think that's a really good example of norm fruit salad. We've already committed in a few other voluntary agreements, such as the IADC debris mitigation rules, not to create long-lived debris and not to create intentional debris, which I think a lot of people overlook that line in some of the documents. And so being able to formalize some of these commitments by taking one step further and making one additional commitment, I think is one option. I am very much aware that there are some political reasons why some states might not sign on. And there might also be technological reasons why some other states might feel as though this is unfair. But I think it would be I think it's a good way to start. And one thing that stands out, though, you mentioned long-lived debris, and that's sort of been a point of debate, both with this proposal, but also with the US DoD tenants, which I think were a good step in the right direction on this. What does that mean? And if we've already committed not to produce long-lived debris, but we still have a debris problem, is that a sufficient commitment, or do we need to go further? And I'm not a technical person, but I do know that with the growing congestion in space and increasing safety hazards as we're using space more and there's more objects, more and more people are starting to lean towards the fact that any debris, any additional piece of debris is one too many. And so is it long-lived or is it no debris? Is it sort of status quo, where you can do an ASAT test that has debris that might be there for a few months? Or do we really want to move forward and beef up this commitment with a focus on no kinetic anti-satellite tests? And I think we have to focus on moving forward and continually improving our commitments, both for safety and sustainability, but also for security. Sorry, I don't want to ramble.
Thank you. Other thoughts from the panel about this?
Victoria, I'll take a swing at it. And so since we're in the SSA policy forum this morning, I hope you'll permit me to wonk out on policy for just a second, because one of my favorite public policy models in terms of thinking about when sort of when the time for ideas has come is something called it's called the policy streams model, and it sort of says there's basically 3 criteria that have to be in place in order for a window to open to create policy change, right? And the 3 streams are there has to be a recognition of the problem, there has to be a clear agreement or consensus on what the solution for that problem ought to be, and then third, there has to be the political will to really do something about it. And I'm generalizing a little bit here, so you'll forgive me. And so I think when you look at something like a debris generating ASAT ban or testing ban or whatever it actually is, you have to ask yourself, do we have all 3 of those conditions in place today? And I think there is actually quite a growing recognition that debris is a problem, whether that's more generally, the problems of space debris, or specifically, focus on the ASAT question. The next question, the next stream, right, do we have agreement on the solution? And that one I'm not quite sure. I haven't, and maybe this letter that Jessica mentioned is something I hadn't seen before. I don't know exactly what the precise proposal is, that we would actually want to take on. Is it a debris generating testing ban, or is it a systems ban, or is it an altitude ban? What exactly is it are we talking about? And then third, I think, is the political will. And that's the one that's the most tricky to sort of predict in advance, because sometimes world events are what shape that change in political will. And so I'm not going to answer your question directly, Victoria, but rather just to offer this framework for thinking about number 1, are we there today, and number 2, if we're not there, what are the steps that the community would need to take to kind of create the conditions for change?
Thank you, Audrey. Any other thoughts from the panel on this?
Victoria, I can give it another go if you can hear me.
Of course.
Well, I hope this time it works. I think that the issue of space debris is a very good example to showcase the 2 key messages that the ICRC is trying to deliver in the future discussion relating to responsible behavior. Because I think we have to look at the space debris and its humanitarian consequences on civilian life. Whether it is long-lived or not, the creation of debris would risk damaging or destroying in unpredictable manner other space objects that could be those support safety critical civilian activities and essential civilian services on Earth. And I think, as previous speaker has mentioned, this risk is increasing due to the congestion of space. And also, I think the existing rules in international humanitarian law would also shed light on future norms development for situations outside an armed conflict. But in any case, be it long-lived or not, debris and the risk of creating debris and its indirect effects have to be calculated or to be considered when we assess the proportionality of action or activity of a state or non-state actor. All foreseeable direct and indirect incidental harm or damage to civilian objects has to be considered when making a decision to in fact create debris. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Victoria, if I could just jump in real quick. I think it's really positive that you see in both the US submission, the DoD tenants, and all of these other submissions, lots of language on this particular issue. And I think you're also hearing it a lot there at the AMOS conference as well. And I think one of the important things about the open-ended working group that the UK is proposing is that this will be a forum to educate countries, and particularly have those conversations about what is long-lived. What do we mean by debris? What do we mean by deliberate? What is accidental debris? All of those questions that we really should have a conversation of, because that will help us figure out what we really want to commit to, and then see what the international community thinks is the art of the possible. Thanks.
Thank you. David, do you want to jump in, or are you good? You're good. I don't blame you. All right, so another question, when we talk about norms, the question is how many participants need to agree before we can say a norm has emerged? Do we need all countries to agree to any norms that come out of this open-ended working group process? Or can we go ahead with a majority, a plurality, or some fraction thereof? And if so, name names. Who do we really need to be involved in this to make sure the norms are carried out? Anyone?
So I need David to be involved. And if David is not involved, then we're not going to get it done. It really has been the UK's leadership through David that has really pushed this forward in all seriousness, and his ambassador in the CD. But sorry to jump in, but real quick, just to say, I think there's many approaches. I think, the cyber context is a really good example of how norms can evolve. Where some groups of countries can come together and then bring it to other groups of countries and then bring it to the UN. And so I don't know that I have any, one set group, but I do think that by having 164 countries vote yes on this UN resolution, and then bringing all of the countries of the UN to have a conversation on this is really a very positive way forward to get a lot of buy-in on this. Thanks.
Anyone else? All right, David, and then Jess.
I'm going to have to speak on this one, aren't I? I can't duck two in a row. I think part of this is realism as well as to what can be achieved in 2 years. So what we're really hopeful of is the mandate of the open-ended working group will have the three things. It'll sort of look at where we are in the current frameworks that exist around sort of globally on space and space threats. It'll also look at what those threats are, and it'll actually just start to approach the idea of how behaviours could respond or mitigate or manage those threats. And at the end of a 2-year process, which will be a consensus-based process with this wide participation, what we can really hope to achieve is have a set, say, a few paragraphs, a few pages at the end of a report that says these nations discussed what behaviours might mean. A behaviour is an act, an activity, an omission, that we consider signals and data to be just as important as the threats to the satellites themselves. There'll be a whole series of elements to this report that allow us to make progress and in this incremental open manner that say a little bit, as Audrey said, do we actually understand the problem? Have we defined the problem? Have we set it out in a way that 190 nations agree with? And then after that, you can start to think about, okay, which of those behaviours and activities might we go after? Because I would argue that actually the bit that we're really interested in is things like signals interference or jamming and spoofing, where the behaviours-based approach is so very different to the capability approach. And so it will take us time to get there. Thanks.
Thank you. Jess?
Yes, I appreciate that David said process so many times, because that's really what norm building is. It's not so much a document that states sign off on, but a coming together and agreeing on principles and objectives, and at the end of the day, implementing. And so at the end of 2 years, there might not be a lot on paper. I think hopefully there'll be a really good process that's been started and will continue to build. But even when we have rules agreed to, the process doesn't end, or you don't have norms. And so then it comes to convincing others, implementing them ourselves, having conversations about how it's going. And so for me, I see this as the beginning of a really long engagement at the international level on a topic that we've kind of sidelined and overlooked for a long time. So I'm not sure it's about the number and the who so much as the how, and really getting that process right and seeing it through. And I'll be employed hopefully for a really long time working on this.
Employment's always a good thing. Anyone else? Okay, I don't think anyone. One of the questions I had, I mean, obviously we're talking norms in multilateral settings, by its very nature, multilateral means countries. But obviously there's a role for the commercial sector involved in establishing norms of behavior, or considering what's considered responsible behavior. I don't think it's necessarily a matter of spaceflight safety when the commercial sector is involved. So how do we get the commercial sector involved in these conversations about what norms of behavior are? Or are they purely going to be implementing whatever norms are agreed upon at the multilateral level? What's the panel's thoughts on that?
So Victoria, I'll start just by saying that, I do think it's helpful to make some amount of distinction between security and safety, or stability and sustainability. You can sort of choose your words. I hope that our private sector is not, thinking about deliberately jamming other people's satellites or testing anti-satellite weapons, right, and creating a bunch of debris, right? Which isn't to say that there aren't, for example, inadvertent, harmful interference with other people's satellites, right? Inadvertent creations of debris, that of course all actors, should be following. But I think what we need to focus on, sort of in this, certainly in this UN process and this open-ended working group that is potentially going to be established, is really that security dimension of norms. And I don't know that the private sector necessarily has a role there. I think the private sector's value is really when thinking about norms that apply to everyone, all space actors, regardless of what your mission is. Everyone who drives on the roads has to follow the same traffic rules. But sometimes the police get to sort of cut the line, right, because they're responding to an emergency or something like that. So there could be sort of some distinction between norms that government or military actors follow versus norms that everyone follows. And I think the real value add for the private sector is in that broader conversation on safety and sustainability and just overall predictability of the domain versus sort of the somewhat more narrowly focused discussion on stability and security.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel? Okay. Moving on to the next question. This is from Teresa Hitchens. Do you think at some point there will be an actual legal agreement on certain rules, in the model, for example, of the law of the sea? And as well, can the panel address the need to actually use and enforce the treaty agreements that are out there, such as the ITU prohibition on deliberate interference? Perhaps an aspirational. Jessica.
Yeah, I know legal treaties are not in fashion so much anymore, but it is important to realize and to remember a lot of countries are still aiming for that and pushing for that. And to have it as a long-term objective, I think is good. We always need to be striving. Some of that just comes down to diplomatic preferences as well. So I'm going to hold out hope that before I retire, there will be some sort of legal agreement that binds states together as a long-term goal. I'm not sure what it will look like or how long it will take. But I think ignoring sort of that desire on behalf of many in the international community is short-sighted, even if for now we want to focus on voluntary norms. These are very much not exclusive. These complement one another. Most of our treaties are built on existing norms. When it comes to arms control, norms of non-use precede a lot of our treaties, and in some cases the norms follow from the treaties. And so these are interactive processes that don't exclude one another. And I think approaching the problem holistically from how do we prevent an arms race in outer space and prevent violent conflict perspective, what are the many different tools that we can use to this end, is valuable.
Thank you. Anyone else? David.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting questions, and if anybody's got any good ideas, I'd really like to hear them, to be honest, is how you write into law the concept of perception. So I go back to this idea that if you do action A, then I feel threatened. It's very hard to write in a treaty that you must not do A or B or C because it's mostly context specific. So I agree with Jessica. I think we all strive to this idea that somehow we could constrain the activity that causes harm to others. But somehow, to me, a series of understood practices between states seems much more realistic than a codified, legally binding outcome. Although we have to be really careful to sort of understand that most nations would really like that outcome. But again, it comes back to this idea that you're not really talking about limiting capabilities, you're limiting activity. It's very hard to stop a nation having a truck with a jammer in it. What we want to say is, if you have that truck with a jammer in it and you jam this particular signal, GNSS signals or SATCOM signals or Earth imagery, perhaps of missile silos, if you do that, then I think you're about to start World War III. Well, how you write that into a treaty is really, really difficult. It's not to say we shouldn't, but I think the utility of this work is much more about avoiding escalation, miscalculation, and avoiding conflict. And I think that comes from this common understanding. So we will keep going with this work, and then perhaps someday somebody will come up with a really clever way of expressing that in law. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else for final thoughts on this issue?
If I may, Victoria?
Of course.
Thanks. I would say the outcome would be too soon to predict, but from the humanitarian perspective, in light of the risks of significant civilian harm that I presented on off just now because of irresponsible behaviors or use of weapons in outer space, I think states should be encouraged to consider additional rules, especially from the point of view of strengthening protection for civilians. And I think the Outer Space Treaty some decades ago was an example of states trying to do so. And we certainly hope that the discussion on responsible behavior will also contribute to the goal of strengthening behavior, strengthening protection for civilians. So I think for this purpose, it is again important to stress that the discussion should be structured in such a way that is consistent with and strives to strengthen the existing legal framework. Of course, we understand that there are differences between states' views as to how existing law applies to outer space. So that's why we think this should also be considered as part of the discussion in the future OEWG. And I appreciate that some of the speakers I recall, including Jessica and Eric, mentioned that any development of voluntary norms should not alter states' obligation under existing international law. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. With that, I think.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just to say, I think form is going to fit the function. There's so many models out there. I look at the incidents at sea agreements as one example where many countries have incidents at sea treaties. But then in the Asia Pacific, they've chosen to take that same language and put it into a code of unplanned encounters at sea, or CUES. So it really will depend on where we get and what we decide is the best approach to move all of this forward. And that's where, coming back to Jessica's point about, this is a process. This is also a jobs plan for diplomats. And so we'll just have to see where all of this goes. Thank you.
Well, with that, I think we're actually on time. So I'd like to thank the panel for their excellent remarks. We're rooting for you guys. Good luck with these discussions. And please join me in thanking them for their expertise.